Welcome, everybody. In the spirit of Rupert and Jeanette Costa's founding relationship to our campus, I want to begin this teaching by recognizing the sovereignty of the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luceño, and Serrano peoples, as well as their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this institution is inhabited by indigenous peoples from all over the world and includes our faculty, students, and staff. It's with a sense of gratitude and obligation that I ask us to acknowledge the conditions that allowed us the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. I look forward to working with all of you to decolonize this campus. Welcome, everybody, to the October 1st teaching on the University Anti-Blackness and Policing. I want to introduce this teaching as I kick off to a statewide, University of California system-wide, year-long campaign to abolish the police from our campuses. Jonathan's going to share a couple of slides. If you can see this, I'd like to also let folks know that you can spotlight our ASL interpreters if you're trying to follow this. But you can follow the UCFTP campaign, and if you're at UC Riverside, you can follow the UCR chapter of the FTP campaign on Twitter and Facebook. You can also follow on Instagram. I also want to direct your attention to some upcoming events. On November 5th, about a month from now, if you don't mind scrolling up to the next slide, John. Oh, that's my bad, that was the right one, November 5th. The November 5th follow-up teaching on abolition, Black study, and Black studies. This will be available to anybody who wants to attend, but it is focused on a project to initiate a Black studies department at UC Riverside, with panelists Jasmine Young from Ethnic Studies, Boris Nunley from English, Naja Whitson from Critical Dance Studies, and Imani K. Johnson from Critical Dance Studies. That's coming up in a month, folks. I also want to indicate a couple other upcoming seminars organized and sponsored by the Critical Resistance Abolitionist Educator Series. You can find all the information on that link, criticalresistance.org. In a couple weeks, October 15th, there'll be a panel titled Campus After Cops, Building Abolitionist Communities. Same time, 1 to 2:30 PST, 4 to 5:30 Eastern Time. November 12th, there'll be yet a third panel, Abolitionist University, Education for Liberation. Again, same time, 1 to 2:30 PST, 4 to 5:30 Eastern. I want to continue by thanking the co-sponsors, co-organizers, and collaborators on this event, especially my cohorts with the Critical Resistance Abolitionist Educators Group, Erica Miners, Nick Mitchell, and Setsu Shigematsu. I especially want to thank Critical Resistance National Development Director, Jess Heaney, the folks from Scholars for Social Justice who are live streaming this event, the UCFTP Collective, the Riverside Faculty Association, the American Studies Association's Freedom Courses series, of which this teaching will be a part, and special thank you to our ASL interpreters for this event, Risa Rojas and Ashley Paul. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists and kick this thing off. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Our first panelist, who's seated right next to me, is João Costa Vargas, who's professor in anthropology at the UCR Plantation. He has published and co-edited numerous books, including Never Meant to Survive, Genocide and Utopias in Black Diaspora Communities, Catching Hell in the City of Angels, Life and Meanings of Blackness in South Central Los Angeles, and State of White Supremacy, Racism, Governance, and the United States, co-edited with Moon Ki Jung. Professor Vargas' most recent book, which I consider to be required reading, is titled The Denial of Anti-Blackness, Multiracial Redemption and Black Suffering. Our second panelist, Savannah Shange from UC Santa Cruz, is a Black queer feminist scholar currently serving as assistant professor of anthropology and principal faculty in critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz, and is a proud alumni of BYP 100. She serves on the board of Black Feminist Future. Savannah is a former classroom teacher and college counselor in the San Francisco Unified and Oakland Unified School Districts. Her research interests include gentrification, multiracial coalition, ethnographic ethics, Black femme gender, and abolition. Her first book, Progressive Dystopia, Abolition, Anti-Blackness, and Schooling in San Francisco, came out last year. through Duke University Press and is an ethnography on the afterlife of slavery as lived in the Bay Area. Our third panelist, who has a very busy day today, he's going to be organizing as soon as he logs off of this session, so we're grateful to have him here, is Professor Lester Spence from Johns Hopkins. He is professor of political science and Africana studies. He's an award-winning scholar and teacher, and he's currently working on projects examining the contemporary HIV/AIDS crisis in Black communities, policing, and Afro-realism. Cathy Cohen is also here from the University of Chicago. Professor Cohen is professor and author of 2 books, The Boundaries of Blackness, which I think everybody's read, and Democracy Remixed. She's also co-editor of the volume Women Transforming Politics. She's part of the leadership of Scholars for Social Justice, shout out, and a member of the faculty campaign #MoreThanDiversity at the University of Chicago. Oh, I'm Dylan Rodriguez. I'm faculty here at the UCR Plantation too. I will introduce the student discussants as they come forward, but I want to start the panel. I want to kick the panel off by asking some questions that are directed to each panelist. Lester, I know we have limited time with you because you're organizing today, but let me start with you. Talk to us about how the university operates as an institution of policing through its established policies and points of access and admission, its control of resources and racialized gendered knowledge production, as well as its formal ties to the expansion of technologies of policing and militarization. What kinds of innovative Black-led campus organizing are already and constantly underway to make this analysis visible?
Okay, can you guys hear me? Y'all can hear me? All right, so first things first, I'm actually gonna cut and paste a link in the chat that everybody should be able to see. I signed up for this and I really believe strongly with what you all are doing, but something's going on literally at 4:30 my time and I've committed to that. And so what I did was I just did like maybe a 40-50 minute lecture that I have in the link, in which I take this answer, the short answer, and I extend it and take on some of the questions. What I'll do in the short time I have is I'll focus on Hopkins policies and then try to talk a little bit about the organizing, right? So when you think about what the university does broadly in kind of reproducing the neoliberal turn or advanced capitalism, and which has intra-racial dynamics, there are a few different ways you can cut that, right? So one is to think about the knowledge structure itself. And it's important to note that while we can talk about the university, it's really important for individuals at specific universities to think about how they fit specifically in this dynamic. So what I'm about to talk about is unique to Hopkins. There are ways in which it overlaps with Riverside and schools like Chicago, but there are ways it doesn't. So for example, political science. Hopkins itself was the second or third political science department founded in the country, if not the world. And there's this moment in time, the 1890s or so, where European powers are trying to figure out how to deal with the colonial question, with these colonies that I have, in a way that doesn't generate conflict. 1885, you have the Berlin Conference. And what Hopkins does explicitly is kind of create a structure of political science that defines international relations as basically a race relations question. In fact, the first journal of political science was actually the Journal of Race Development. President Wilson's agenda, President Wilson's racist agenda, was actually begun in many ways at Johns Hopkins, where he was a graduate student. So if you just take that political science dynamic and then extend it to include political science as a whole, although you have people like Cathy, people like myself, people like Errol Henderson, people like Vessela Weaver, who are extending political science in order to talk about politics, in order to make race the center of the project. I always try to give a shout out to Cathy when I'm on one of these things with her. As a graduate student, Cathy and a number of other graduate students actually created their own syllabus and gave that to graduate students, the professors, political science professors were telling them that they were, a number of Black and brown folk who were in graduate school were like trying to figure out how exactly they could learn about race and politics. Their professors told them explicitly that the reason they couldn't be formally taught about racial politics was because there was no literature on racial politics. So Cathy and them, as graduate students, Cathy Cohen, Todd Shaw, Errol Henderson, a range of other folk, actually created a syllabus themselves and gave that to their professors, right? So, but with that said, political science still has this core that's deeply racist. Now you can take that story for each of the other disciplines. In fact, you can even take it to gender studies, to ethnic studies, and to Black studies, and to talk about how their, not just how their conception of the human, how their conception of knowledge, they end up reproducing the neoliberal turn as opposed to contesting it. And that has interracial consequences. But really, I was wrapping my head around this Blackness thing. It's really important to note it has intra-racial consequences. One of the challenges now, so I noted that people like Cathy and then me coming under them, we actually tried to contest this knowledge stuff when we were in graduate school. When we were in graduate school, it wasn't really possible to get a job in racial politics. It's now possible to not just get a job, but it's actually possible to get kind of paid, actually articulating yourself as a scholar of racial politics in some way, and then articulating yourself as quote unquote woke in a way. So it's really important to understand that we have to figure out ways to actually deal with this question that simultaneously acknowledges the role policing plays in knowledge production, acknowledging the role police plays in these communities, and connecting them. Because if you don't connect them in a certain way, then what's going to happen is this policing project in the university is going to become primary, and what you'll have is Black and brown folk articulating their own personal interests as the interests of a group, right? So I talk a little bit about that in the longer lecture. Political policies, Hopkins political policies. Hopkins actually does not pay taxes. They offer services in lieu of taxes. That has a significant consequence on Baltimore. Baltimore spends $500 million on policing, in part because entities like Hopkins aren't paying what they should in taxes. They've got a political policy of actually rewarding donors. So Johns Hopkins has a board of trustees. In order to be on that board of trustees, you actually have to have given massive money to the university, and you have to show yourself as actually having the potential to give more money. So to the extent they've got democratic accountability mechanisms, those accountability mechanisms are actually structured by wealth, and they reproduce wealth. Development policies. Entities like Hopkins, actually, in some ways, they do schooling on the side. And in a lot of times what they are real estate developers, right? So what you've got in Hopkins' case is they're redeveloping both the area near where I teach, and then they're redeveloping segments of one of the most important transportation thoroughfares in the city, and then they're redeveloping areas around the medical school. If we think about the scholarship on policing, what we're now seeing increasingly is that the scholarship on policing shows that there's a policing gentrification dynamic. The more a space gentrifies, the more it requires policing. Hopkins has actually not only tried to support in some ways the policing dynamic of the BPD. Over the past few years, they've actually tried to push forward a policy whereby they have their own private police force. That policy comes at the same time as they're redeveloping a number of different areas. Hopkins administration has actually gone as far as to bring down former Mayor Bloomberg to lobby for that dynamic in Annapolis, has actually given money to the former mayor, Cathy Pugh, in order to get her support for that. Admissions policies are deeply, deeply exclusionary. Hopkins room and board plus tuition costs about $70K. By definition, you kind of have to have a certain degree of wealth to actually support that. So there's more stuff I want to talk that I talk about. Again, I talk about this in this lecture that I have the Zoom link for you in the thing. And I want to talk about organizing. Then I'll leave. Organizing. I'm reading the chat as I'm talking. Organizing. So when there are all types of folks who have been organizing in Baltimore. One of the blessings of being at a school like Hopkins is folks have been organizing in Baltimore for more than a minute. And it's really, the organizing has really come from two different components. There's a Black radical youth-led left, and there are a number of organizations, but I'll focus on the Baltimore Algebra Project, but there are others. The Baltimore Algebra Project was formed several years ago. It's basically high school students and now alumni who came out of the program, who've basically been doing organizing since even before Occupy Baltimore. And then they've been operating with alongside kind of a white radical left out of entities like the Red Emma's bookstore. And then that organizing, like I said, before Occupy Baltimore, that led into kind of a Black Lives Matter tendency that continues to this day, that actually influenced a multiracial coalition of folk in Hopkins that had a student component, that had a faculty component that was small, but was actually growing. And what happened is those two entities, it was really students. The faculty worked alongside of them, but there was kind of a firewall, right, for a number of different reasons. The students used a combination of traditional political means, going to lobby down in Annapolis, and then also protest. They sat in on, they had the longest protest in Hopkins history in order to contest this private policing dynamic at Hopkins. I think is going to be successful in the wake of COVID and in the wake of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, and Breonna Taylor. We've got a really significant movement, but you know, that remains to be seen. The final thing I'll say before I'm out, and again, I really appreciate this, and shout out to any of the Qs who are in the audience, is it's important to note that as we center Blackness in our analysis, at least in the Hopkins instance, a number of the folk who are organizing at Hopkins against police did so knowing that they weren't that they would not be directly harmed by policing at all. You're talking about white folk, you're talking about straight folk. And they did so organizing on behalf and with Black folk, but simultaneously, there are Black folk who actually benefited from the policing, or in some cases, which are even more complicated, they will articulate public statements against policing, but then privately they meet with the president and other administrators to get resources for themselves. So again, I think I took a little bit more time than I wanted. I really appreciate the work you all do, and I'll link to the lecture one more time because I see some people are having problems with it. And then on that note, I'll be out. Thank you.
Hey, deep appreciation to you, Lester. Thank you. Thank you for giving us your time, and looking forward to seeing you soon. Let me move to our second question. This is for Savannah. How do you understand the relationship between schools, including universities, and the institution we call the police? How is anti-Blackness foundational and pervasive as an animating and structural logic of the university and policing? I can think of no better person to ask this question to than you, Savannah.
That's a great question. First, I also want to thank everybody for bringing us here, everyone who organized this event, especially those who organized me. So Shauna, Sarah, Nick, SA, thank you for organizing the Black faculty on UC campuses. And I want to just be honest that I'm speaking today really in the thick of the kind of chatter that's happening in the wake of this presidential debate, not to comment on the trash that is federal politics in the United States, but really comment on how we talk to one another, right? And so I'm seeing a lot of folks just in the past 48 hours spend more time attacking other people for the tactics they're using than organizing them. And so I just want to say directly that, especially for those of us who have a long-standing multi-generational critique and antagonism of this place that claims to be the United States, I think we really need to figure out a way to channel that righteous rage into bringing people into relation and into what Tanya Lee would call principled struggle, right? As opposed to using our rage as a way to experience catharsis by saying, y'all are trash because you're voting, right? Just not that anyone here is saying that, but just kind of saying that I think that's a false refuge that doesn't necessarily organize us and keep us safer, stronger, and more oriented toward the long-term goal of abolition of all policing, prisons, and anything else that shortens Black and Indigenous life. That having been said, I think one piece about schooling and policing, we've all heard the school to prison pipeline. Many of us either taught in, worked at, went to schools that had, you know, metal detectors in the front, that have school resource officers, right? This very literal ways in which police are in schools. There's dedicated budgets within, you know, many school districts for policing. And I also want to articulate that there's a big difference between police and policing. And sometimes we can spend so much time thinking about the police that we don't think about the larger logics and practices of policing, that they are just one example of.
Okay. So I am not able to stay on.
Appreciate attention to, let's talk about our actual campuses. Yes, police out of university, but also thinking about our own campuses. And, you know, I work at UC Santa Cruz, right? And there's a lot of overlap between my experience working at UC Santa Cruz, which is this, you know, progressive bastion. There are literal billboards and flags, yes, flags on campus that say the original authority and questioning authority. Flags that flew above the heads of cops that were beating undergraduate students, right? And corralling grad students who are trying to get a living wage. And so I think for me, the attention to how policing and how kind of the fatal reach of the state has nothing to do with how progressive a place is really important. Because, so like, I'll just say a little bit about the work that I've done in terms of progressive schooling and how this connects. So the kind of schools I'm working at and that I research, and this is kind of places where students lead protests with their teachers, right? Not against them. We're like Dolores Huerta, Philip Cruz, Yuri Kochiyama, Asada Shakur. These kinds of people are not just talked about in the curriculum, but really held up as paragons of civic participation, right? When you graduate, we want you to be like them. And yet, this is where we see that old rallying cry. And so you've ever heard of, like, you know, education, not incarceration. Actually, ENI, Education Not Incarceration, was the name of an incredible organization based in San Francisco. And so this idea of education, not incarceration, can create a false binary between these two sectors. And I don't want to say that there is no difference, right? So we need to be really real that on every level in the United States, from the federal level to the state level to the city level, our government spends more than half to 70% of our shared wealth on policing, right? Whether it's at the city level, in terms of city police, at the state level with sheriffs who are, you know, coming to literally evict people out of foreclosed homes, or at the national level, right, where the military ends up exacting the same kinds of fatal exercises, policing the entire world, right, and continuing ongoing U.S. You know, killer empire. So when that happens, that biggest chunk of funding goes to police and policing, veterans benefits, et cetera, right? The next three chunks of our public funding are education, healthcare, and housing, right? That's the last three pieces of what you might even think of as anything like a welfare state here in the US. And each of those sites, we know, education, housing, and healthcare are also places where bodies, lives are so tightly policed, right? Whether it's kids getting locked up in school, whether it's the medical industrial complex telling that some of our community members, your healthcare doesn't count, right? Whether it's from abortion to hormone therapies, right? So many people's genders, bodies, and lives are policed in the medical industrial complex, right? And then you had in the site of housing, the way that HUD and public housing practices intersect with parole, policing, right? The kinds of really brutal attacks on Black autonomy, right? And respectability. It says, oh, your family doesn't look just like this, particularly for Black and Indigenous families, right? We just saw you know, cases going to the Supreme Court telling Indigenous folks that they don't even have the right to claim their own children, right? And so I think we know that each of these spaces are battlegrounds, and yet these are also places where the battle is not over. So I'm not saying that it's not important to stage sites of extending life, right, in education, housing, and healthcare, but that we need to understand that those are not refuges. They are exactly that battlegrounds, right? And so when we head into that battle, I think when I'm thinking about, so the school that I wrote about in my work, right, it's important to say this wasn't just like a terrible school. Hey, baby.
There's someone at the door.
We'll just gonna have to leave at the door, baby.
They keep ringing the doorbell.
You ain't gotta worry about it. It's okay. Trust me, it's gonna be fine. Anywho,
But it might be.
honey, can you wait
Who
1 second?
is it?
I don't know. We had to find out later, baby.
I know that.
The thing that I wanted to say is that the school that I studied was not a terrible place. It actually had some of the best educational outcomes for Black children in the entire state of California, right? So in the state of California, only 1 in 4 high school students meets the A through G requirements to even apply. You can have it, baby. Even apply to a UC system, to a UC school, right? So this is a school that prepared more Black children to enter four-year college, to enter education than any place else in that district. It was also the school that had the most disproportionate rates for suspension, for expulsion, for asking Black kids to leave class. So it's not a one or the other. The very success, the very excellence that they created for Black students was imbricated with exceptional forms of policing and discipline. So I think it's really incumbent upon us, particularly as those who have found some way to make a life in this kind of crazy academic machine, that we don't mistake our chosen form of bondage for escape, right? And so I went to grad school thinking that, oh, we're gonna come back and we got these really high suspension rates for Black students. I worked at the school, and we're gonna come back, I'm gonna try to fix this, right? I went to grad school, realized you don't learn how to fix things in grad school, but more importantly, I realized that the school is not the problem. And by me thinking, by any of us thinking that we can fix these problems inside the school or inside the school campus without attending to the larger cloth they are part of, we're not going to do anything except for first of all, believe in the neoliberal idea that you can just individualize yourself out of a problem and let empire, settlement, and slavery off the hook. Because the school that I studied was not the problem. The problem is that it's an American school. It's the United States that is the problem. So we have all these places full of people who are busting their asses and doing their best. And if we continue to look at teachers, faculty, students, turn it in as the place to enact our intervention, we're really missing an opportunity to look at this bigger picture. And so, we hear so often that, that thing people say, like, California built 23 prisons and only 1 college, right? Since like 1990, right? We hear this all the time. But we forget to talk about how every single one of those college campuses has a dedicated police force, right? So it's not an even exchange. And so even though each one of those 23, all the CSU campuses, all the UC campuses, they have dedicated police forces for now, right? We finna get them off our campuses. The day that we abolish cops, the day that we win cops off campus, there's not a single uniformed police officer, no ICE allowed on any one of these campuses. Are we as students, staff, faculty gonna be safe on those campuses the next day? No, right? And so I think we really need to understand that abolishing uniformed police is just clearing the way for us to abolish the police that live in our heads and the police that live in our hearts, and stop the policing processes that continue to rank, separate who is deserving of the extension of life, who is deserving autonomy, and who is not.
Hey, thank you. I hope everyone's following just the way the analysis is being pushed by our first 2 panelists. And I expect it's going to get pushed even further by our 3rd panelist. I'm going to pose this question to Cathy Cohen. Cathy, if the university is a kind of 21st century neoliberal plantation, how should we understand the function of Black bodies, Black students, Black faculty, Black administrators, and other so-called people of color who work for the university in perpetuating various functions of policing, especially in a moment when the University of California has hired its first Black president and recently hired its first Black provost. So help us with that, Cathy.
All right, thanks, Dylan. First of all, I just want to thank all the folks who I know worked hard to pull this event together. You always have to kind of work hard to do this work. It really is an honor to be a part of this conversation. And I think, how we are building and in conversation together. I want to say also that I'm really happy to be a part of this discussion where I can highlight incredible activism happening at the University of Chicago, by student groups like Care Not Cops and Ethnic Studies Now, by staff groups like Library Activist Network, and our own faculty campaign entitled More Than Diversity. All of this work is kind of challenging the university across a range of issues, including policing. But let me turn real quick to the question that you asked about 21st century university as a neoliberal plantation. Okay, so I want to take up first maybe the easier part of the question, and that is the nature of the neoliberal university. I think most folks who are here today surely understand the university is neoliberal with its restructuring of labor, including the expansion of and dependence on, for example, non-unionized adjuncts, non-unionized grad students, temporary and seasonal workers used in cafeterias and other such sites throughout the university. We've also watched administrators kind of double down and invest in the sciences, computation, policy schools, or those sites considered to be, right, the production of practical and applied knowledge, right? Those areas of the university most interesting to the donor class. Also, the university, as we all know, is a space of hierarchy. Some in elite institutions, like the institution where I'm from, University of Chicago, are provided with what we might call relative autonomy, right, to engage in knowledge production, too often read and evaluated only by other people at elite institutions, while most folks laboring in the academy are asked to teach, not a bad endeavor, but different from the kind of narration of the academy as a focus on the life of the mind. And across kind of the hierarchical structure we call the academy, students are increasingly understood as consumers with relative buying power depending on their wealth and status. And so, you know, we could go on and on. I think we all agree about the idea of the neoliberal university. But now let's kind of think together about the question of the university as a neoliberal plantation. And here I think we want to lean on the incredible work of kind of radical scholars and activists who remind us of the fundamentals of anti-Blackness and white supremacy provided, you know, that they provided the foundation and lifeblood for universities and colleges. We know those enslaved literally built many of our campuses, and that the profits from their work was used to fund universities. But of course, the work of anti-Blackness and white supremacy within the university extends far beyond slavery, right? It includes the university as sites of knowledge production meant to exploit, experiment on, and perfect strategies of regulation, surveillance, and policing targeting Black, Indigenous people. It includes the university as the largest, often largest employer in and near BIPOC communities, where they can use their power to extract resources and tax agreements from highly leveraged cities, labor, and neighborhoods, right? It includes the university's impact on Black communities as landowner, kind of gathering land, demolishing buildings, destabilizing communities, and then literally redistributing the land to those businesses, faculty, and some staff that they want to kind of serve as a buffer surrounding them. It is fundamentally the logic of the plantation, its established racial hierarchy, and its extractive practice facilitated by racial capitalism that I think resonates in many ways with how poor people, how BIPOC communities, as well as BIPOC students, staff, and faculty understand or at least experience the university today. So with regard to policing on campus, right? So we got neoliberal, we got the plantation, now the policing. With regard to policing, we know that surveillance, regulation, and punishment of our behavior happens regularly through numerous avenues. Of course, there is the explicit policing on campus by the campus police force and security guards who are trained to see Black bodies as dangerous, as violent, and as people not organic or welcome to the campus community unless they're thought to be workers. These are forces, their forces are deployed not only to kind of control who's allowed on campus, but increasingly to manage what happens off campus. Thus, absent kind of actual economic, social, and political investment and empowerment in communities, right, surrounding universities and colleges, An investment is made instead in policing as a way to shield those who supposedly belong to the university from the rightful anger, rage, and resistance of those who have been neglected resources, opportunities, and power. And now this is to Savannah's point. So while the work of policing through force, I think, is one example of the work of a neoliberal university, the project of policing the intellectual work of the university may be just as important, right? How we think about ourselves. Universities and colleges talk of diversity, but what they mean is a kind of representational diversity, deploying Black bodies at will in diversity materials. Or they mean sanctioning the study of BIPOC communities and other marginal subjects in centers, programs, and new departments across our campuses. But those are in many ways almost like, outposts of the colonies, right? Instead, what we see is there's a superficial diversity. Colleges and universities are instead committed to policing and preserving the power of traditional disciplines that they believe define the academy and largely control the reproduction of sanctioned knowledge and the professoriate. So these campers kind of tinker with diversity on the margins, hiring, to Dylan's point, maybe one or two folks or administrators of color to satisfy student demands and problematic optics. But generally, they continue to leave largely unchanged the process of tenure, the curriculum that students will be exposed to, which students populate our classes, who sits on the board of trustees, who constitutes the administration, at least the administrators with real power to control the fundamental work of the university, right? That's the second part of the policing of the university, the second part of the neoliberal plantation and policing. This is maybe the less visible form of policing that universities engage in. I want to say just really quickly about this point that Dylan raised about Black administrators. I would push beyond Black administrators to say, in fact, how do we think about these spaces that, in fact, we believe we control? So if we understand something like African American studies, right, to be a place that is expansive, right, that's concerned with issues of liberation and justice for Black people, then we have to ask ourselves, what role are those sites of knowledge production? How are they engaged in the resistance to get cops off campus, to challenge the kind of multiple forms of policing, right? It is, of course, incumbent upon us to challenge the university, but we have to question to what degree those sites like African American studies are about us or about the university, right? So I guess I just want to say, so, while we, of course, want to ask for no more cops on campus, I think we must work and struggle to challenge really all the forms of policing and the kind of reproduction of plantation logics that the university pursues and puts forward. And I think when we do that work, right, then we will really see the kind of radical reimagining of the university, both what is taught, what is produced, and who is there and who controls it. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. That actually feeds into the idea that I think some of us have been trying to push recently, which is that we have to stop talking about campus police and campus administration as if they're somehow separate from each other. I know at the University of California, the police actually report to an administrator. So in effect, the chief of police is a university administrator. So we got to stop talking about these apparatuses within the university like they're separate. The university administration is the police and the police are the administration. It's a direct continuity, a direct line. So we got to stop making that artificial distinction. I appreciate that. The last kickoff question I want to ask is for our fourth panelist, my colleague here at UC Riverside, Professor João Costa Vargas. This is for you, João. How is anti-Blackness obscured or erased in the rhetoric, organizing practices, and agendas of police reform, police defunding, and even abolition-oriented activism? What are the stakes and consequences of obscuring and minimizing anti-Blackness in our understanding and analysis of the university and its policing function?
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, the organizers. Thank you for your question. Answering your question by reminding ourselves that there's not much in the current moment. Black folks have been experiencing anti-Black genocide. The current pandemic is one among many pandemics that affect Black people disproportionately. Through multiracial coalitions and through struggle in civil society, the struggle will lead to increased levels of incorporation into these previously segregated institutions. The world of racism suggests that through these struggles, institutions can be changed and the world can be changed with persistent and these multiracial alliances. These multiracial alliances in the world of racism, particularly from a progressive perspective, require multiracial alliances politically and require analytical frameworks that take into account multiraciality. The red pill is the pill that opens up the world of anti-Blackness. In the world of anti-Blackness, we have the fundamental division between Blacks on the one hand and non-Blacks on the other. So even though Black people are critical for the constitution of what we understand to be the human and the social, Black folks are expelled from both the human family and environments of sociability, normative environments of sociability. In the world of anti-Blackness, the alliances that matter are the ones that recognize the fundamental place of Black people in the constitution of the world we inhabit. That means that multiracial alliances are a possibility, not a necessity. That means also that whereas for those struggling in the world of racism, a new world is possible. In the world of anti-Blackness, once you've taken the red pill, nothing short of a totally different world will do. And that's my understanding of what abolition means. Abolition needs to be connected always with this fundamental recognition of the centrality of Black people in the constitution of the world we live in. To respond to Dylan's question then, when we disavow the language of anti-Blackness, we are basically disavowing this always and already marginalized, anti-human and anti-social position that Black people occupy. As the panelists have indicated, administrators writ large everywhere have become quite adept at dealing with the language and requirements that emanate from racism and white supremacy. Those administrators writ large have no language and have no action vis-a-vis the demands of anti-Blackness. I'm reminded of Fanon's directive that the real lift consists of introducing invention into existence. If we are to introduce invention into existence, we need to take into account seriously the singularity and centrality of anti-Blackness and develop languages and practices accordingly. What kinds of languages, what kind of practices will allow us to both criticize our current notions of who we are, the human, and how we interact with each other, the social. But our current language has no perspective on what it means to live outside of those paradigms. So that's how I would respond to Dylan's question. Thank you.
I think João just brought home why this panel is framed the way it is. It's a red pill panel, if that wasn't clear already. And with that, I want to open the floor up a little bit to some of our student activists, student organizers, student radicals, who are going to be framing some questions for the rest of the panel during the remainder of our time. I want to ask I want to ask Sophia Rivas. I'm going to ask you to come forward, and I'm going to introduce you real quick. First question to the panel comes from Sophia Rivas. She's a first-year graduate student at the School of Education with a concentration on diversity and equity. She comes out with a bachelor in ethnic studies. And crucially for this panel, she is the outreach coordinator for Underground Scholars. Sophia, pose your question.
So my question is, for those who have never come into contact with police violence, how would you describe it as a part of everyday life? What would the everyday life look like if we focused on collective healing and community building rather than punishment?
Maybe I can take the first part of the question, or I don't know, which is, first of all, thanks for the question. It's a very important one. I mean, the question is about kind of what does it feel, police violence in the kind of the everyday life. And as I was thinking about this, I thought of two things, that both it is the kind of nature of randomness, right? That, and also predictability, which might not seem like it goes together, but it does, right? That there is a way in which if you come from communities that are being hyper-police, it is something that you can predict, right? When Black people say, oh yeah, I knew that was going to happen, you recognize the pattern of kind of white supremacy, of anti-Blackness in your life. But it's also the randomness, right? That it can happen at any moment, that you can have what appears to be a traditional or usual encounter with the police, and the next time you can have an encounter that costs you your life, right? So it is both the nature of predictability and kind of randomness, and the overall sense of threat, right? The idea that in fact any encounter can lead to something that can lead to the end of one's life, but also the disruption of community, the disruption of family, all of those things. The second point, which is what would it look like, I think you said, if we focused on collective healing and community building. I think the spaces where I have seen that is in kind of movement work, right? Where organizers and activist organizations, especially in this generation, who understand the work of liberation to include care, to be thinking about what does it mean to engage in collective struggle, but also collective support and joy, right? That there is a way in which we talk about a radical empathy, that what happens to you happens to me, that I'm invested in your well-being because in fact, it's part of my well-being. Now that becomes dependent on the transformation of resources and structure so that we are allowed to have all the things we need to be fully human, to be, to have growth, to have intimacy, to have joy, to have opportunity, to have, comfort, to not worry about the randomness and also the predictability of threat. It seems to me there are these places, these kind of maroon sites that are not outside the state, but outside sometimes the visible nature of the state, that allow us to see what is possible. But I'll let the other panelists jump in.
I think that's the idea of not outside of, but happening concurrent with the state is really helpful. And I guess I'll say two things. I think there's the idea that you can kind of somehow graduate out of contact with police. The very first week I was on the UC campus, I was pulled over by UC Santa Cruz police for speeding on campus, right? And so I think that, and when I was pulled over for speeding, he said, oh, you must be a new staff member, right? So both the impossibility that there would be Black faculty, right? And the regularization of staff and of non-academic people as the people that it's okay to police, right? So I think the displacing and intensification of certain kinds of surveillance on certain kinds of not just bodies, but roles within this machine. The other thing I would say is I think that there are folks who are, you piloted it kind of like we switch from punishment to care, right? So I think those are really not connected in some ways. I read something recently from an incarcerated incarcerated scholar named Stevie, who publishes their work, without their government name. We talked about the difference between security and safety, and how police, there's harm, real harm happens, right? And instead of actually making you safe, the police give you security, and you hold on to that in the absence of being safe, particularly as Black people, from the people who are supposed to love you. Most of the people who hurt us are not the police, the people who live in our houses, who've grown up with our whole lives. So how do you interrupt these much more everyday forms of violence, childhood sexual assault, intimate partner violence, rape? How do we interrupt those structures of violence in ways that actually make us safe, right? As opposed to just inflicting more harm. And so I really found a great resource. Speaking of like activist work, if you haven't seen the Beyond Survival anthology, that's an incredible anthology, but also every single contributor is already doing that work. So just literally looking up the work of folks in that anthology is a place to start in terms of, who is already creating these communities of, yes, care for those we love and want to be in community with, and also creating shapes of accountability and shapes of protection with those who have created harm and that we want to be safe from without further endangering them and those who rely on them.
Thank you for that question, Sophia. I want to introduce our next student, Precious Fasikin. Precious is a fourth-year student of economics and anthropology. She's host, journalist, and student manager at the campus radio station, KUCR, a recipient of the Chancellor's Research Fellowship and the Underground Scholars Initiative co-president. Her research focuses on sub-Saharan Africa and the potential to utilize community-based methods for empowerment and equity in the global South. Her interests lay at the intersection of socioeconomics, media and journalism studies, cooperative economics, and Africana studies. And with that, I'm going to yield the microphone to Precious to ask the next question of the panel.
I'm here as a representative of the Underground Scholars Initiative. And as formerly incarcerated and system-impacted students, we can know a very linear relationship between the violence behind bars and the violence in our communities. So I wanted to ask you all, what do you view the role of the state in of reinforcing and bolstering this relationship? How can we explore that, and what can you know about this relationship?
And for that first response, I'm going to go to our panelist on site. I'll give it to João.
Thank you, Precious. So the role of the state, one way to think about the state, which I would rather call the empire state, is that it builds from the replaceability and abjection of Black folks fundamentally, be it the United States, be it Brazil, be it Colombia. Black folks occupy a central place in what we understand as the empire state. That means that what is conceptualized as the state apparatus, as we perceive as state practice, as we embody in terms of disciplines and in terms of our places in the modes of production, needs to be connected always to anti-Blackness, and how Black people were never meant to be part of these modern empire states. The exception, of course, is Haiti in the Americas I'm talking about. Americas, of course, as the concept put forward by Lélio Gonzalez. So how do we understand the state? The state would be a representation, would be a bureaucracy, would be a set of practices and relationships that enforce and reproduce these notions of the social and the human. So to think of prisons, to think of the carceral empire state, is to think of ways in which the lives fundamentally of Black people are constantly devalued. So we have to constantly connect the various sides of the carceral empire state. It's not just the prisons, it's not just the schools, it's not just the neighborhoods, it's not just our places of work, but it is, and excuse my French, the whole fucking world.
Well, we'll move to the third question. Appreciate that. Let me introduce our third student. It's my pleasure to introduce Ariana Turner, who is a fourth-year filmmaking and media and cultural studies double major. She's the founder of Let's Take Action and serves as the Green Campus Action Plan Marketing Director. Ariana.
Hi all, it's nice to be here. So my question is, despite the global movements against anti-Black policing, many still believe police abolition is undesirable or unattainable. How do we address this structure of belief? What is the difference between defunding the police and abolishing the police? And why is abolition the best route to take when dealing with police?
Thank you for the question. It was great. I hate to do this. I'm going to answer kind of as a social scientist, which I play in the university, right? I like data, so to speak. I mean, this question of defund versus abolition, I think has to do with one's kind of fundamental understanding, could have to do with one's fundamental understanding of the dangers of allowing policing to stay in place. There is some people would say there's a kind of medium position, which is don't completely abolish the police, but in fact, defund them significantly and allow the framework of our thinking around policing to say that at least we've reduced their harm and we can then reinvest in those communities to provide other types of opportunities. I will say a couple different things quickly. One is, I think when we focus on abolition, then we can fundamentally question both the history, the construction, and the work of policing, right? It allows us and forces us to reimagine what does collective life look like without policing. And it means what are all the other things that communities need to have full and meaningful lives without the threat of policing as a way to kind of keep people in line and keep people regulated, right? So it I think truncates our ability to fully embrace and fully imagine a world where people are generative, where they're happy, where they have joy, where they have possibility, right? Because we always hold out this institution of punishment, surveillance, and regulation, right? Now, this is the social scientist in me, which is when I look at our data, most folks are not prepared to say abolish the police, and in many cases, they're not prepared to say completely defund the police. But part of that, I would argue, is our work, right? Our work is how do we provide spaces where people can fully reimagine, are given the opportunity to reimagine this question of safety versus security, right? Versus policing. Like, what might safety truly look like absent the institution of policing? And I think it's incumbent upon us to have those discussions, to foster that possibility. At the University of Chicago, we are asking for the abolition of the U of C police. And part of what we're doing through our More Than Diversity campaign is we're spending a year engaged in dialogue with folks in community to think about reimagining public safety, right? Not just focused on, and of course it's important to get the police off campus, but what might public safety look like? And what might people dream of? And when we only define safety by policing, people will always say, I want policing. But when we provide the opportunity for people to reimagine safety outside of policing, then we can kind of reach possibilities beyond policing. So for me, that's why abolition is so critical, right? Because it forces us not to fall back on the possibility of policing, but in fact, to think more broadly about what might be possible. But Savannah, I know did you want to say something?
I'm mostly just, this is just exclamation points, underlines, or snaps to what you said, Cathy. Because I feel like there's two pieces. One, now defund has become very popularized, but I first came to know defund as the first piece of a three-part saying, which was, one second, baby, defund. Oh, I got a message. Okay, I'm excited. Defund. You got to do it yourself, baby.
It's
Defund.
staying there for 4 days.
Okay, great. I'm excited. Defund, disarm, and dismantle, right? The defund is actually the first part of a tripartite effort in which you first defund. And in some ways that just gets, it could be thought of as like a weakening. It gets away from this like too big to fail kind of piece. So get something to a manageable size, then take the actual certain kinds of lethal weapons away. Although we see that every single part, from vehicles to knees to boots to hands of the police state and the police body is a weapon, right? And then get into the part of dismantling and taking it down to those, just what Cathy was saying, the actual form and function, dismantling, taking those things apart, jettisoning some and repurposing others, right? So there's that. But I think the piece that's really helpful about your question is, what do you do about these people who want to keep the police? And I think I would divide those people into two rough groups. There's one group of people who have the veneer of investment. They think of the police as something that keeps them safe, right? But it's really a veneer of safety, right? And they have real experiences of harm, right? They have real fears and anxiety of harm. And they do the kind of double, triple leap in their mind to associate, oh, if the police are there, then this terrible thing that happened to me won't happen again, right? Or then I'll be able to protect my daughter from something happening to her that I think is way bad and out there. And part of that has to do, and I keep bringing up sexual assault because usually when we get in these conversations with people say, well, what about the rapist? Bro, the rapist is sitting at the damn Thanksgiving table. And I think if we get into those real conversations about what is that feeling, and this is where you have to start talking to faith leaders. You have to start talking to people who are actually accustomed to getting in the affective space, right? What is it that you are actually afraid of? And how have the police actually usually kept you safe? Usually if you have a conversation with somebody, but what's envisioned right now, the place and time you felt the most safe, right? And have people really move through that. The number of people in which there's a cop in that position, in that visualization, right, is almost none. So I think there's that piece of dismantling that veneer of safety. But the other side is people who really actually want the police, right? Because they fundamentally think that the protection of their property is more important than a Black child's life, right? Is more important than an Indigenous mother's ability to keep her child, right? And so those people are antithetical to your safety and existence. I think the other thing is like, not everybody's gonna come over here, right? And there are people who are still invested in their property being more important than Black life. Those are the people who are still bitter that their Black life isn't their property. You know what I'm saying? People are always like, oh, they say we're a threat. They think this is a threat to their way of life. That's ridiculous. No, baby. You know what else is a threat to their way of life? The abolition of chattel slavery, right? The partial abolition of chattel slavery, which, you know, we ain't gonna get into that, but that is a fundamental threat to somebody's way of life. So if somebody says this is a threat, it's not because they're misperceiving or blowing something out of proportion. The abolition of policing is a direct threat to what we know as American empire, right? And so I think that that's not something that that's not the only way to engage it. But if we don't understand that we're making a big ask, right? There's not gonna be a consensus. There's not a consensus ask, right? Then people really have to get to that place of, are you willing to give something up? Right? And if they're not willing to give something up, then there's a different conversation about, okay, then what do we do with what I think is eventually going to be a minority of people who are really going to be 10 toes down on the side of private property, which is to say 10 toes down on the side of empire.
Thank you for that, Cathy and Savannah. I want to introduce our fourth student who's here, Cynthia Ayala. Cynthia is a first-generation college student at UCR. She's majoring in anthropology, law, and society, and pursuing a career in law. She's director of communications for the UCR chapter of Underground Scholars Initiative. I'm gonna hand it to Cynthia.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor. All right, so my question to you is, UCRPD has been one of the departments whose budget has not been affected during this pandemic. While the UCR School of Public Policy and entire UCR Division I athletics program are being threatened with complete elimination. How could UCRPD's funding be better allocated
for the benefit of the students? What are the alternatives of university police? What might that look like, and how does it provide safety?
I'm going to go right to our on-site UCR colleague to start us off with a response to that question. Thank you for your question, Cynthia. I would like to answer it by, again, entering the world of the red pill. I would like to suggest that our model of managing resources at the university in our communities need to be completely revisited. We have too many problems to be thinking about how a few millions of dollars that sustains this repressive police can be channeled elsewhere. I would like to suggest that we have to think of our university space as being organically and necessarily connected with our surrounding communities, near and far. That means that UCR, for example, has over 60% of students in a condition of food insecurity. It's 60%, right? More than 60%. UCR sits on a corridor that's one of the most polluted of the world, if not the most polluted. It sits on stolen indigenous land. UCR has no public transportation that accesses it directly. So all of these issues, I think, need to be put into the conversation in the spirit of an abolitionist practice, not as an objective, not as a already defined set of goals, but rather as re-envisioning the world that we want to live in. What is that kind of world? And that needs to be the question. In the world of the red pill, in the world of anti-Blackness, what are the conditions of possibility that enable all of us to live without the necessary physical and social death of Black folks, which is what we are experiencing today. So that's how I would frame your question, Cynthia. It's a broad answer, but it gives us yet another opportunity to think about this abolitionist practice as a probably never achievable goal, but as a fundamentally necessary process if we are to say stop with the death of Black folks.
Thank you. I want to open it up to Cathy and Savannah.
Let me just very quickly, I want to say I totally agree, João. I think the question then becomes, for me, where are the sites, the formations, the politics, right, that allow folks to have those types of conversations about how do we envision, how do we take over, how do we reimagine, right, what systems and schools and universities and campuses are supposed to do. How are they accountable to the communities from which many of us come, we feel connected to, we study, and should be accountable to, right? I mean, I think you are absolutely right. Having said that, I also don't want to dismiss, and I know you weren't, right, the significance of the question of saying, to me, it's a question of invest, divest, right? Which is to say, if we get the police off and we have some of that money, how might we invest it? Who gets to control those decisions? Who, you know, to me, it's also like, it's a strategy, an organizing strategy to say, understand that another way to think about why you don't want police on campus is, in fact, it can enhance the resources available to you for the things you want to do. It just seems to me that there are, of course, short-term strategies for engagement and organizing, and then that has to lead to long-term vision of the radical reimagining of education. I think if we start just with that, we lose some people. And it is the kind of back and forth that hopefully gets us where we want to be.
I mean, I think that's I'm not oscillation, but like a dance between the vision and where we're at, right? And being able to support folks in developing their own visions. It may be different than the visions we came in trying to organize them into, right? They're proliferating visions. And I think being able to work in that negative space is important. This is going to be kind of controversial, though. I'm not that familiar with Riverside, so I can speak more to like the Berkeley context, because I live in Oakland and Santa Cruz. Sometimes that funding, we can get really trapped in this idea that universities are for students, right? When universities are actually for more people, workplaces, right? And so what would it mean if we didn't take that funding and spend it on something for the students, right? But thinking about what does a wage look like for janitorial and restaurant staff, right? What have they been asking for years? What about community members who lived in that place long before these dorms were built, who can't even afford their rent, or sitting piled 6 and 7 households on top of each other? Can that money just be a straight cut of rent out to community members that have no way of getting into the university? What about the students who busted their butt in high school for a 2.9, are not A through G eligible in the California system, right? And now are slogging through being pushed out of classes in JCs? Can we take that money and send it to a community college that's criminally under-resourced? And so I think one piece is trying to imagine, kind of really break out of the university's lie that it's going to take all this public money and dedicate it to this select group, right? How can we really maintain the public promise of the public university and see all of us the National Board of the United States is not something that really holds in the university, right? Because you have students there who cross the border every day, workers who cross the border every day just to participate in the university system.
Thank you all. I want to introduce our 5th student discussant, Alberto Flores. Alberto is a second-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology here at UC Riverside. As an undergraduate at UCLA, he was part of the Underground Scholars Initiative and the $1 Million Hoods Project, which influenced his graduate research. His current study is situated in the Inland Empire and focuses on intersectional experiences, perceptions, and legal cynicism as it relates to residents' race, ethnicity, and gender. I'll hand it to you, Alberto.
Hello, everyone. So universities in the Netherlands and most universities in the United Kingdom do not have university police departments. And many K-12 school districts in the United States, including Oakland Unified, have eliminated police presence. Do these examples serve as models for us, for our US universities without police?
Can I ask a question before we answer that? Can we disrupt this? Can Alberto comment on his question? Because I suspect they have insight. You asked the question, you have insights about the ideas. I mean, I don't mean to mess things up, but this,
right. Well,
students ask the questions, we answer, I feel like is not all that productive. So
yeah, so I noticed this when I was abroad, actually at Food University in Amsterdam. And I was getting a tour from the chancellor there. And one of the first things I noticed was there was no presence of university police. As an undergraduate at UCLA, university police were everywhere. So I was surprised, and I asked the chancellor, well, where's the university police? And then he said, there is none. And I said, what about when there are protests on campus? And he said, well, we usually take them food, we take them pizza, we take them water. And I'm like, wow, like universities here are heavily militarized when we have protests, as we may see later today. So that got me thinking, and I mean, I think it's possible for universities of California and universities in the US to have no police departments, right? If they can do it, why can't we do it, right? So these other highly developed nations have obviously lower incarceration rates, and it's because that we invest in policing a huge portion, and it disproportionately affects us. So I think it is possible, and I think there are models that we should start to follow. That was unexpected, but thank you.
You want to start us off, Cathy?
Well, I mean, I would say I agree. I'm going to suggest that that ending police on campus is, as I said earlier, is one part of the logic of policing that dominates and guides the way in which policing in the largest sense happens at universities and at colleges, right? So I think your observations are absolutely right? That part of what we are asking for is the abolition of police on campus, the abolition of police in elementary schools, right? But I think, we want to engage in a broader discussion about what are the logics of policing, the ways in which there's the reproduction of who belongs and who doesn't, the ways in which people are excluded and pushed off of campus. There's policing in terms of who gets money to come to campus. There's policing in terms of what tests that you have to take. I mean, there are all these kind of sites of regulation and surveillance and exclusion and punishment that we, I think, want to be attuned to. But to your point, I think if we stop police, it allows us then to think about these other places, these other sites of regulation that we want to target. So I would support your analysis that, in fact, this is a possibility and something part of what we should be struggling for. Yeah.
I would chime in, especially on the Oakland tip. I've been a little bit apprised of and done a little bit of collaboration with BOP, the Black Organizing Project, which has led a 10-year campaign to get police out of Oakland schools. And I think as opposed to thinking like, oh, this is a model for us to copy the outcome, can it be a model for us to engage in the same kind of long form struggle, right? So that the George Floyd resolution that passed a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago at this point got a lot of press, but it actually just cut the budget of actual OPD police officers, of which I think there were 7 in the Oakland Unified School District, but there's still hundreds of school resource officers who previously were supervised by those police, right? So the real impact of that intervention of this is a big win in a campaign that has not ended, right? So what BOP is working on is really thinking through, okay, we got rid of the bosses of those who were asked to enforce this kind of violence, right? How do we, and a lot of the folks are saying, no, we want to retain those school resource officer positions because they see that if they just take those positions away, there's one more cut to the school. And thinking about how can we repurpose and retrain the school resource positions, who are often folks from the community, mostly Latinx and Black men who work in the schools, who can't actually have other ways to work in schools because of the kinds of gatekeeping, right, to those kind of positions. What would it mean? How do we use these existing infrastructures of policing and repurpose them? And so I think, as opposed to like, oh, look, they won, really thinking about, okay, they've gotten one clearing and really still in the navigation piece. But in terms of Holland, I mean, I'm not trying to, I also went to school in Holland, and that's not my aspiration, right? I don't aspire towards a criminally colonial, inherently racist, small, smug European state as my political destiny. And so like, you ask certain of these folks who can't even get into VU University about whether that is something to aspire towards, right? And so Holland, you think about the UK too, these are countries with long colonial pasts that are also colonial presence, who have created such a thick veneer of prestige around their kinds of social stratification that it's racialized with like almost no, without even necessarily even having a rhetoric to talk about racism. You ask most Dutch leaders won't even acknowledge that there is racism in their country, and they have a whole holiday just for blackface. Like they still have Zwarte Piet, you know what I'm saying, in Holland. So I think it's important to look at that state and national context. And theirs is a true nation state, right? The kinds of nationalism that happened in Holland. There's bridges there that you say, oh, it says built in 863. You think, oh, they took that one before the 1863. No, baby, that bridge been there since 863. So I think it's important that we don't necessarily look to the metropole as a model for something that looks like democracy.
That's such a well-framed way to address this. So I really appreciate that. And the chat's also blowing up, so everyone read that chat. Our final student discussant, it's my pleasure to introduce Brianna Simmons. Brianna is a third-year PhD with the Department of Anthropology here at UCR. Despite living in Riverside for years, she calls somewhere else home. Between their love for cooking, somatic, and artistic releases, she makes time for her project, a brief, cautiously engaged ethnography focusing on carceral geographies of health and care practices in the wake of the medical insurance complex in Kisumu, Kenya. While attending to how Kenya's economic dependence fortifies an infrastructure of anti-Blackness, she is equally interested in how families with minor children must restructure family kinship, labor, and care practices to navigate inequitable healthcare, and how hospital detention is an endorsed trajectory of those experiences. Invested to her commitment, she works in many ways to demonstrate, as Saidiya Hartman said, nothing need be this way. Brianna.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Well, okay. Thank you
Yes.
all for sharing, holding, and occupying this space. My question's a bit long, so I'll read it slowly. I'm always learning, but thus far, I've noticed similarities between Blackness and abolition. I see a paradoxical nature of death and creation, imagination and suppression, grieving and clearing while building. Towards visions of safety and policing abolition at our academic plantations and everyday spaces, which spaces and voices must be created and or centered to bring them into practice as a first part. And within that, please gesture to which state or community positions, conversations included, prevent these changes.
Thank you, Brianna. Your question reminds me of a recent event I was at. It was a virtual event, but it was based in Rio. And a longtime activist who had spent their entire life in the blue pills world, so to speak. This person had a central role in how the Brazilian Empire State finally listened to some of Black people's demands and instituted affirmative action reforms, instituted family stipend, which lifted pretty much 50 million people out of poverty, most of whom were Black. In short, this person firmly believed in the redemption and openness of the Brazilian Empire State. And this person gave a lecture a few weeks ago and finished their lecture pointing out that their mistake, meaning that entire generation's mistake, that was astounding, was that they had not incorporated the consciousness of the runaway slave. That, to me, indicates that the first step in this necessary work of abolition is to recognize that what we have around us in terms of institutions, in terms of social relations, are not repairable. We need to start over. That also indicates that once we accept that we are not wanted and that we are not loved, that we don't belong, this is very liberating. It becomes a matter of not us having to educate, love, and accept the other, but rather it becomes a matter of us finding each and every way necessary for our own survival. These are very different, and I would say incompatible propositions. So once we accept the consciousness of the runaway slave, we begin this hard and infinite work of abolition. That's how I would respond to your question.
I'm sorry, I'm still taking notes on that sermon from João, so you'll have to give me a moment.
This is being recorded. It will be posted as part of the American Studies Association Freedom Courses series. It'll be on the Scholars for Social Justice site. You can definitely take notes.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna just so one more again. Once we accept that we are not wanted, that we are not loved, that we don't belong, it's very liberating. Yes. The only thing that I mean, there's nothing really to add to that. I think I'd rather spend this time kind of digging deeper into what João just said. This piece around what would prevent these changes, Brianna, I mean, I think that's a little bit of a matter of, I know we don't like to talk about this word, but faith. There's nothing that's going to prevent abolition. It might try to slow it, right? But we have to know the half-life of empire has passed, right? And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean we're going to see the end, but just to know that this is not sustainable and will not be sustained, right? It's already clear that late capital empire, it's already on its way out. The question is, are we going to hasten it? Or what is the story that's going to be told about our folks long after we're gone, right? What kind of ancestors you want to be? These are the kind of questions to ask, but I don't think we need to ask, like, is this going to be forever? Because we already know that it's not, right? And so I think orienting ourselves towards an ongoing process, right, that begins with running away, right, that begins with refusing to be killed, that once we realize that we're not starting something and we're also not going to end it, but that we're joining this long and infinite work, right, that's already begun. And in some ways, it's already done.
Cathy, can you close us out?
I can't. I mean, I agree. I think with everything, I also, though, think I want to center us around what are the political formations that move this work forward, right? It is that part of the understanding that we are not wanted, we are not loved in this thing we may be called the academy, but there are spaces, in fact, where we are seen and loved and centered. That, to me, is what's incumbent upon us to build those spaces, right? So to me, for example, the work I do, and Sarah Haley and Gatachu and Barbara Ransby, and we can go down a whole list of people, Dylan, trying to build scholars for social justice, right? A kind of radical left formation where individuals who understand themselves to be scholars can leverage resources towards a radical vision of what's possible and the reimagining of this thing we call maybe the academy and beyond, right? To me, that's the critical work that we have to do. There's so much work, right? But where are we building these spaces again for people to reimagine what might be possible, to people to connect collectively, to engage in kind of progressive left transformational politics, right? To understand also, let's be real, the privilege that we have as tenured or tenure track professors that are different than other people who are laboring in the university, to be able to step back and center those folks who have less security, staff who have less security. I'm at a university that talks about free speech, but it doesn't support free speech for staff, right? At a university that has decided that the way, in fact, they provide safety for faculty and students is not only a formal police force, but an underpaid force of largely Black people who stand on corners around the university so that they can report, right? Crime, right? So it is understanding polices policing in its broadest sense, but understanding where we have to build kind of those radical sites of struggle. And understanding that it is, yes, the police force, yes, it's administrators, but yes, we have to hold accountable the academic units that purport to that we supposedly control and that purport to kind of highlight and amplify the communities from which we come, right? All of this is problematic, but at the center of it has to be kind of an understanding of power and what does it mean to build transformation, to build power, to build transformational power, right? To base build. So I think that's what I would point to.
I want to thank our panelists, Cathy, Cohen, Savannah, Shange, João, Vargas, and Lester Spence, who's not here, but he's out there somewhere. I want to say thank you to all you, give you a virtual applause, but I also want to say thank you to all the folks here at UCR. I want to thank Cynthia, Precious, Alberto, Sophia, Brianna, Ariana, everyone who's here. I'm going to give you a view of the folks that are here. I want to say thank you to all y'all for the labor you put out. It is a hot day in Riverside. It's probably about 109 out here. This is no joke. And thank you all. Thank you all for the patience. Oh, hey, show that again, Taisha. Show that again, Taisha. Black study is abolition.
Hey.
Abolition is Black study. That's Taisha Paget, our colleague.
Maybe.
Again, this is a kickoff. There's a lot more work to be done. I want to extend my appreciation to everybody who bared with us as we balanced the in-person component of this teaching with the online component of this teaching, dealt with the audio hiccups, dealt with the fact that we had to manage time, that we had 6 students that I think you each could have facilitated a 1-hour dialogue with these panelists. So I got to say that I regret that we didn't make this an 8-hour teaching. Next time we will. But thank you to all you. And there's a direct action right now on the UC Riverside campus. So come join us. Folks are meeting in lot 1. We're doing a properly socially distanced direct action. There will be a car caravan. We've made signs. There's elders, there's youngsters, there's everybody in between. And we got plenty of hand sanitizer. So thank you again to everybody who's here. I could feel it in the chat. Stay healthy. And let the words that came through today sink in with you as we start to think about how best to undertake the work of abolition as Black study, as part of the genealogy of Black radicalism, and as a way to liberate the planet, to transform the planet, to end the planet as a structure of anti-Blackness. That is the whole point of today's gathering. And I want to express my appreciation to all you who are here and all you all that are online. Thanks to everybody who managed this as well. All right, you all.
There's a great question about Venmo links for organizers. And so if there are folks, particularly students or organizers who have that kind of, those kind of links that folks are asking if they can directly send coin, especially to organizers, especially the student organizers. If you could drop those, that'd be awesome.
Right on. You know what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna post my personal email address on here. If there's links to organizers and organizations that you'd like me to post once this goes up on the Freedom Courses YouTube channel, I'd be happy to include them. So I'm gonna put my email address right now. Otherwise, I'll see you all soon. Those of you that are logging off, I'll see you all soon. I'll post my email right now.